Hi, good Wednesday afternoon. This is Alesa Loftus, and I'm here with Jimmie Ratliff. Today, we're going to talk about reasonable accommodations in the workplace, what your responsibilities are, as well as your employer's responsibility. So, Jimmie, let's start with the most obvious question. What is reasonable accommodation?
Sure. So, reasonable accommodation is a modification of a work environment that helps an individual with a disability to have equal opportunities in their employment, or to be able to perform their job duties in a more efficient or more productive manner.
Okay. And are employers required to provide those reasonable accommodations?
So employees are required to provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities, and that's in accordance with Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Okay. Now, when should someone request a reasonable accommodation from an employer? Should that be during their interview process? Not until after they're hired? I mean, is there a best time?
There probably is a best time, and we'll talk about that. One thing I do want to start off with, though, is it's very important for a prospective employee or an employee to remember that they are the ones who have to request the reasonable accommodation. So even if you have a disability and you're already employed and you feel like you need an accommodation, or if you're going to a prospective employer and you feel like you'll need a reasonable accommodation, as the employee, you have to be the one to initiate that. You're just not automatically given a reasonable accommodation without a request.
Right.
So back to the question of when should it be requested. Generally, it's the earlier the better. So it can be requested any time, however. It can be requested whenever you're at the interview process for the employment opportunity, or after you're already an employee. If you encounter some sort of a barrier in the workplace, then that's a really good time to make a request. And you really want to make those types of requests for an accommodation or removal of that barrier or a modification as soon as you're aware of it, before it begins to affect your job performance and things of that nature. Requesting proactively is always the best choice. You want to be able to let your employer know about that request, so it's important to have kind of an open way to talk to your employer about that. You want to approach your employer and say, I have a disability, I would like a reasonable accommodation, this is what the reasonable accommodation is, and then you and your employer should be open to discuss that accommodation, and they may provide an alternate accommodation that may or may not work for you, but you'll want to be able to have those types of conversations. And also, whenever you do have that conversation, it's always best to provide some sort of a written documentation or a letter that just kind of mirrors what you're saying for your request. It's easier for you to be able to track that you made that request and have documentation for that, and it also makes it easier for your employer to have documentation of that request so that they can take appropriate actions.
Okay. So if I have a disability and at the beginning of my job, when I got hired, that would be kind of an obvious thing that I would want to ask for accommodation if I needed it.
Correct.
But say I don't have a disability when I'm hired,
Mm-hmm.
and I've even worked there 6 months or a year or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So do I still have the right to ask for an accommodation if I develop a disability that I need accommodation for?
Yes, and your employer has the same obligation to look at that request and see if it's something that is reasonable that they can make, or to discuss alternate accommodations with you. But when it comes down to it, the employer is required to make some sort of reasonable accommodation for you. Again, make sure that conversation is open, and as soon as you know about the need for it, to address it at that time.
Right. And do I have to tell the employer what my disability is?
You don't necessarily have to tell your employer what your disability is, but there are times when, if your disability maybe isn't obvious, they may require some additional medical documentation as an employer, and that may be something that's required at a point.
Great, that's good to know. So are there times when the employers don't have to provide reasonable accommodation?
So there are. First, if an employer says that they're not going to provide reasonable accommodation for you, one thing that you may look at doing is filing an appeal with the company if they have some procedure for that. Maybe if there's a chain of command, kind of go up that chain, or look at their personnel policies or their policies and see how that's governed in the company and make an appeal there first. And then you can also make an appeal to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission if you don't get anywhere with that. But there are some times whenever an employer does not have to provide an accommodation that's requested. And a lot of times this is because it causes something that is called an undue hardship. And basically what that means is the accommodation would create some sort of a significant difficulty or an expense for the employer. The assessment for that's kind of made on a case-by-case basis. And it considers things like what kind of resources does the employer have to make these type of implementations or accommodations, what that cost looks like, and then does it impact business operations. So does the whole business have to be rethought or rearranged to make the accommodation? And that might be something that is considered an undue hardship on the employer, where they may be able to say, we can't make this accommodation. It's not a reasonable accommodation for a company to make.
Okay. And the ADA recognizes a high multitude of disabilities. I mean, there's more than anybody could name. So for accommodations, are there different accommodations depending on a disability?
Yeah, so accommodations for somebody who has a disability that may limit their mobility would probably be different than an accommodation that would be requested by somebody who has an intellectual disability. So let me give you a couple of examples. An accommodation for someone with reduced mobility might be modifying an existing area to better facilitate that accessibility. Having things like the space for wheelchair access or use of other assistive devices in the work area, providing things like ramps, accessible door grips or the handles, and accessible restroom facilities. All of those things can make the work environment more accommodating as a whole. Now, if you start looking at individual workspaces where an employee will be spending most of their time doing work, you can look at things that are fairly easy to implement. These are things like adjustable desks or workspaces. You might look at expanding those work areas to be, again, more accommodating for mobility or assistive devices, where people aren't maybe bumping into things or that they're not kind of squeezed into too tight in a corner or something.
Yeah.
Other things could be more ergonomic office furniture that makes it more comfortable for them to be in that area. Even things like phones that are hands-free for someone who may have some sort of dexterity issue. Those can all be different, easily implemented accommodations. And something as simple as rearranging an office space where an individual will be working their individual workspace to remove physical barriers from their path of movement to and from their workspace and around their workspace. Those can be a type of reasonable accommodation as well.
Pretty simple to do with most cases, I would think. Then, I mean, even like if somebody couldn't stand for a long period of time, bringing in a stool to sit on when they needed to take a break to get some, weight off their legs or their back or something.
Right.
So.
One of the resources that we looked at also said that for people who stand for a long time, like the mats that are a little bit thicker, they're made for standing for long times, things like that. That could be an accommodation that could be made. Now, on the other hand, so we talked about how these might be different. If you look at somebody who has maybe an intellectual disability, they may need something that provides a little more detail in how their job should be performed. So a business could do things like maybe if they had a job coach or a human resources person that might be able to kind of guide them in the tasks that they're doing. an employer may look at modifying break schedules if they have a need to take a frequent break or to maybe get away from the crowd for a while or something like that, then that could be something. Another thing is providing detailed written kind of operating procedures, standard operating procedures for the tasks they're going to be performing, so that they can follow it step by step and achieve the goal, whatever that end product is for the task they're performing. Digital applications like a tablet or a phone that has an organizer program on it, or calendars, or even printed calendars or planners, those can help individuals focus more on their tasks and where they're at in that task and what has to be done. So those can all be types of reasonable accommodations as well. Even having a service dog at work can be a reasonable accommodation.
That's right. You know, if you haven't seen it, we recently had Primal People-Bartlesville on our Facebook Live. It was on September 20th. You might want to go back and check that out because we got a lot of information from them about having a service dog and in the workplace even, so they can give you some more information about that kind of accommodation, how you would go about getting one, and all of that. So it's great. It was a great live. We had a lot of fun making it, and go check that out. So if someone has other questions about the reasonable accommodations in the workplace, where would they look?
So the resource that we used primarily for this video was the Job Accommodation Network, or askjan.org. This is a recommended resource by the U.S. Department of Labor for individuals looking for information on reasonable accommodation in the workplace. You can always go to that site to look more. You can also post down in the comments, and we'd be happy to read those and provide feedback or other resources that are a little more in-depth than maybe what we can go into on Facebook. And we're also, in the description of this, we've got a link to that Job Accommodation Network website.
Okay.
And we've also linked over to our friends at Primal People-Bartlesville.
Right.
So be sure you go check them out too, because they are an excellent resource for not just service dogs in the workplace, but service dogs in general.
Yeah.
Questions about training, questions about being in public with a service dog, lots of information. Like Alesa said, go check out that live we did at the end of September, and there's a lot of really interesting information there.
Right, and that's a lot of great information, and it's so in depth. So definitely, I always advise to go and check out the links that we give, because there's a lot more information always involved. Our lives are to give a basic breakdown of things and open up a dialogue. So that's why we always want you to know that we are open for phone calls, visits, comments. You could send us a private message, however you want to communicate with us, and we will do our best to find the answers for you. And so next week, with this being such an in-depth subject, accommodations is really deep. So we're going to have our live next week is going to be on accommodations in housing. So what kind of accommodations you can expect if you're going to rent from someone, or if you're having a new home built, that kind of thing. And I also want to point out to everyone that Friday is October 4th, and that means our first adult puppet group meeting. And that will be at 6 o'clock here at Dynamic Independence. That's 1110 Southeast Frank Phillips Boulevard. And if you have any questions about it, or you just want to give me a heads up that you're coming, our telephone number is 918-335-1314. I look forward to meeting those of you who want to become a part of this. I really plan for this to be a fun and informative group, to where we can learn about the diversities and inclusion and different disabilities, and then pass that knowledge on to the kids. And so if you have a heart for kids, then come on out and join us, see what we're about, because we're really going to plan on doing some great things here in the community with those puppets. I think that's all that I have for you this week. Jimmie and I hope that you'll join us again on next week, and we hope you have a blessed day.
Thank you all. See you next week.